Hi, this is International Master David Pruth, and today I am doing a lesson for beginners about the first move in a chess game. There are exactly 4 moves in the starting position for white which are played regularly by grandmasters, and those moves are c4, d4, e4, and knight to f3. And those are the 4 moves which I won't be talking about today. What I'm going to talk about today are all the other possible first moves. Now, the fact that these moves are very rare at a grandmaster level may correctly lead you to conclude these are not the very best possible first move. One of those 4 moves which is constantly played by grandmasters is most likely the best move, and that is why grandmasters play it. And in fact, these other moves I'm going to show you today are definitely a little bit inferior to those 4 moves. However, they're inferior on a scale of hundredths of a pawn, of tiny little bits of positional advantage and disadvantage, which are really immaterial in the games of amateur players. So you have a license, until you become a grandmaster, to experiment with other first moves and develop your own unique playing style and opening systems. And I know not everybody wants to do that, but I know that some people do. So we definitely have videos about established openings, but today I'm going to introduce to you all the different first moves that are possible and tell you a little something about what's good or bad about each of these moves. And I think whether or not you ever choose to adopt those moves, this will be useful to you for at least 2 reasons. Number 1, as I tell you the pros and cons of these moves, you should be able to learn some lessons about opening play. And number 2, some of your opponents may play these variations. Some of your opponents may watch my video and their interest may be piqued by one of these unusual ways to play chess, and so you may have to face this yourself. Alright, so we're going to begin on the left side of the board and just go left to right here with openings. So the first opening move that I'm going to consider is pawn to a4. Now, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the move pawn to a4? Well, it helps only one white piece. Which piece is that? The rook. This is the only piece whose scope, whose ability to move, has been improved by playing a4. And the second thing that this move does is it gains a little bit of space for white over here on the queen side. Now, this move here, I think, in balance, is not the very best because rooks are the hardest piece to use early in the game. Absolutely the hardest piece. There's a famous saying, which is not to bring your queen out too early. That doesn't always hold, but why don't people say don't bring your rooks out early? Well, because it's almost impossible to bring your rooks out early. They're so unwieldy, and it would take quite a bit of time for white to get this rook going. But once they do, they would find this rook to be a target, just like the queen is, because any piece that attacks the rook, for example, I will attack it with a bishop. Almost any piece that attacks the rook will be threatening to trade for it because the rook is worth more than those pieces. So like the queen, your opponent is going to have the opportunity to bring out pieces while threatening your rook and thus winning time when you have to move your rook again. And really, it's just even harder to get the rook out than the queen, and that's why you see the queen come out more often than the rook, right? Like, for example, in this kind of a scenario, your queen can come out faster and more naturally and actually make threats, whereas it's very, very hard to make use of your rook early in the game. For that reason, a4 is one of the worst openings that you can choose. And one thing that black may consider is to play this right away to control that square with their bishop and not even let you bring out the rook, but they're by no means obliged to because you don't actually even want to bring out your rook. What white would want to do after playing a4 is not try and employ the rook, but rather just to use the space that it has, the hidden power that it's supplying behind this pawn, and keep playing a normal game now with a little bit of a queenside orientation. So for example, maybe playing like e3 to let the bishop out this way, and then trying to advance more pawns on the queen side and build up strength there. And that way you can get some use out of the rook. But in a moment we'll see a better version of this, I think. So another possible move for white is to play pawn to a3, and this move does almost nothing. Basically, this move here is a famous waiting move, which now lets black basically play white, but with your pawn on a3 instead of a2. And this makes a few subtle differences in a whole variety of openings. So for example, if your opponent tried to play the Ruy Lopez, they would find they're not able to because your pawn is covering that square. That's just one example. Well, a3 is actually a perfectly viable move because it doesn't create any weaknesses in white's position. It just forces your opponent to play white. But if they try and follow the opening theory that they know when they're playing white, a lot of their openings are actually not quite going to work, and it's going to be, some kind of, they'll have to realize that they need to reevaluate. And I think this can be a very interesting way to play, and Adolf Anderssen played this way against Paul Morphy. That's a famous example from a long, long time ago. But this is a cool way to play, especially if you've figured out in advance some of your black openings where this move here would help you to eliminate some of white's best possibilities. So that could be fun to try. Now here's another move. What do you think of this one? What are the strengths and weaknesses of this move? Well, the strength of this move is that you've developed a piece and that you've improved your rook's mobility. But this knight doesn't have that much flexibility from this square. It only has two possible squares to go to. I would think that black's best first response against that move is to put a pawn on d5 to try and control the c4 square, which is the better of the two squares the knight could come to. And I think that if you see your opponent play a very solid setup where they really try to keep that knight out of play, they should be able to get an equal game. By the way, it makes a lot of sense to follow up your knight a3 move with c4 if white tries to take that. If black is trying to take that square away from you, you go for the pawn trade, so your knight could get back into the game, and you're also supporting this pawn. So why not attack black's center? If black doesn't play d5, then you won't want to put your pawn there because it would block your own knight. So if black plays a system without e5, then you're going to be looking for a good moment to play knight to c4 or knight to b5. But you'll probably leave your knight here at first. Because if you come into the center right away and your opponent defends the pawn, now you need to worry about him chasing your knight away. So there are some possibilities, like to now play e4 and keep your opponent from playing d5, and now you're playing an e4, e5 opening with your knight on an interesting new square. But I'll leave you to discover those for yourself and move on to the b pawn. All right. So there are two possible moves with the b pawn, and they are both actually viable options. So how about this move? What are the strengths and weaknesses of this move? Well, right away, strengths are it's letting you develop your bishop and to a really, really good square. It also doesn't create any particular weaknesses, so it's a flexible move that doesn't commit white to very much. And the one thing that it does do, though, is it tells black a little bit about where white's pieces are going. And information can be quite valuable in the early stages of a game. So when you're black and your opponent plays a move like b3, one of the most important things in the opening phase of the game is to be able to ask yourself, what does that mean about where white's other pieces are going? And try and make some guesses. And I suggest to you to try and ask yourself right now where you think some of white's pieces are going. And I will now give you my answers, and you can see how much you can sometimes learn from a single move from the opponent. Okay, so first things first, this bishop is probably going to b2. No surprise there. Second thing, this knight. Well, the chances that this knight are going to go to d2 has increased a lot because you're not going to want to play two moves from the very beginning to put your bishop on a long diagonal and then just block it by putting your knight on c3. Right? So probably this knight is coming to d2. Now, b3 also tells you something very important about this bishop over here. And that is that he's probably not going to come out to one of these queenside squares. He's more likely to sit on a restrained square on e2 or g2. Maybe a double fianchetto is possible. Right? It's called a fianchetto. A fianchetto. It's some kind of an Italian word, I think, but I don't know the etymology. A double fianchetto is possible, but here's why you're not so likely to see the bishop come out on the queen side. The point is that these pawns, which make a beautiful home for this bishop, these same pawns restrict this bishop's ability to move around on the queen side. And in fact, he would have a really hard time retreating if he ever gets attacked. Right? These kind of things can happen. Or, let's say you put him here, and black played d5. You wouldn't be able to drop back on this diagonal in order to keep attacking on that diagonal. So, black should take all that into consideration as soon as they say b3 and realize that this bishop is probably going to come to e2 or g2. So that's an example of the kinds of things you can figure out from the very first move. This knight is also quite likely to go to f3, from which it'll fight for the same squares as the bishop, keeping that diagonal open for him. All right, perfectly viable opening. And there are two different ways black can respond, and one leads to a positional game more likely, and one leads to a fight more likely. d5 leads to a more positional game because white gets control of the diagonal they want, and black's going to be able to defend the pawn on d5 without any trouble and have a stronghold in the center, so each side will have their strengths and weaknesses. Whereas e5 by black, the second most likely response, after bishop b2, is going to lead to sharper fighting because this pawn is attacked immediately, and as black backs up this pawn with this, or this, or this, he's got a few ways to do it, he is now setting up a block on this diagonal that white's bishop is on. Well, if you don't do something to deal with that, then white's going to have an inferior game because they set up this bishop on this square for it to be on a good square, not for it to be on a bad square, right? So white is kind of committed to starting a fight to do something about this piece, probably with either f4 or d4 to improve that bishop. All right, now, this move here, b4. It's kind of a combination of a4 and bishop to b2, those two different options. Because on the one hand, a strength of it is that it aims to put the bishop on this square on a nice long diagonal. And on the other hand, this move here aims to gain space on the queen side. And this is what I was referring to when I said there's a better option than a4. I think b4 is better, putting your bishop on b2 more quickly. I'm going to play a random move for black. Putting your bishop on b2 more quickly, but you can definitely follow this up with a4 and c4, trying to gain space on the queen side as well, and that can be a very interesting way to play it. So in particular, if your opponent is playing some setup where they play d5, where they don't fight you for the e5 square, they leave your bishop open, they set up this d5 pawn in the center, it's quite plausible that white will at some point try and build up a lot of space on the queen side with c4 and a4, and this can lead to a very interesting game. Downsides to b4 potentially. Well, one downside is this pawn is hanging, so when black moves their e pawn on the first move in response with e6 or e5, they're developing their game with a threat. Only a pawn, but still a threat. You wouldn't want them to develop their bishop on f8 while taking a pawn of yours, usually. So that's one concern, that this pawn is hanging. The other concern is that you're creating some weaknesses and kind of committing a little bit to trying to take space on the queen side. So you need to be able to back that up, and your opponent can try and exploit that a little bit. Another advantage of this is, since you have more space, you can still use this bishop on the queen side, right? He can retreat like this or like that. So quite an interesting opening for white, and one of the most challenging responses to it is for black to start a sharp battle where he attacks white's pawn, white attacks black's pawn, and black actually gives away his central pawn. Now watch out for bishop takes g7. That's one of your best tricks for white in this opening. He gives away the pawn, hoping to then bring out a bunch of pieces quickly, even though he won't have his center pawn. That's one of the sharpest and key lines in 1b4, and that brings us to 1c3. Now this move I don't have terribly much to say about. What are the strengths of this move? There's only one. It supports and defends a key square in the center. What are the weaknesses of this move? Pretty much only one, that it blocks in this knight. Right? Another small advantage of this move is that it opens up this diagonal for your queen. But basically this move pretty much commits white to playing something with d4, or they can hunker down with some kind of modern setup where they put a lot of pawns on the third rank and don't really attack black very much. but mainly it's going to be associated with playing d4. Now, d4 is a strong move, and c3 will be fine to defend that center pawn. So this is never going to be a bad opening for white. It's just never going to be an exciting opening for white either. Black is going to be able to see that white's probably playing d4, and black can choose from a number of pretty normal defenses against 1d4, and just know that white's playing a variation with c3, which will be solid for white and not so aggressive. So that's pretty much the scoop on c3. Now, d3. So this move here pretty much signals one of two kinds of openings: a King's Indian attack in reverse or a kind of modern system. A strength of this is that you've given your knight an extra square and your bishop an extra square, and you've controlled a square in the center. But you've obviously done that in a relatively more passive way compared to playing a move like d4 or e4. You haven't grabbed as much space, so black has pretty free hand in how they want to respond to this. Now, the main way I would see white developing is, since this pawn is blocking in his bishop, I'm thinking that most likely white's going to play with g3 and bishop g2. And then he can play a more passive modern where he doesn't expand in the center as fast, or he can play something with a very fast e4. He'll be able to support that with a bishop on g2 and a pawn on d3. And if he plays e4 quickly, then he can get some variations of like a King's Indian attack, where the idea would be, I'm going to make random moves for black just to show you what white's setup could be. Now, if you get really greedy, f4, but often you can't get that greedy until you've already castled. If this pawn needs more defense, sometimes you'll move this knight onto d2. And now white's plan will usually be to try and attack on the king side by playing f4, moving this knight maybe, or just moving a bunch of pieces to that side of the board. Of course, you're only going to be doing a kingside attack here with white if black has actually castled that way. And pawn to e3. Well, this is usually going to be followed up by either d4 or b3, switching to like a 1b3 kind of opening, or f4, switching to an opening we'll see in a moment. But basically, this is very likely to transpose in a moment to something else, right? So one thing that black could do is they could play e5, and then if you play d4, you get an exchange French pawn structure. It's a typical structure from some mainline openings. So that wouldn't be too exciting for white. If they want to do something interesting after e5, they probably need to play b3 and then go for a version of b3 bishop to b2. In my opinion, this is just not as good as b3 bishop b2 because you get your bishop to b2 one move slower, and so you don't put as much pressure on black, and they've got a few more choices of what they want to do. So I would definitely prefer b3. I don't think e3 offers anything especially different for white after e5, other than to try and switch to that. And now we come to a really heinous move. So far, I mean, for most moves there were pluses and minuses. Here is a chess move with pretty much only minuses. Those moves do exist, and there are also moves with no minuses, only pluses. The most obvious example is checkmate. Checkmate is always good. There's nothing you can say wrong about playing checkmate. Okay, so this move, what does it do? It blocks in your knight. Well, you were trying to bring out your knight, not block it, right? Remember, our goal is not to block in the only two pieces which can move in the starting position. Our goal is to help out the pieces that couldn't move, right? These are the pieces we want to improve in the starting position: the rooks, bishops, and queen, and also you actually want to bring your knight out. But if white's plan is to do something like this, blocking in his knights, and then maybe here blocking in this knight as well, he is really doing the absolute opposite of playing chess. He's giving himself a horrible, horrible position. And in fact, there is another downside to playing 1f3. And that downside is that you're opening a weak diagonal to your king. So, if you look at the silly moves I just played, black would actually have the opportunity to win the game on move 3. Yeah, move 3. That's how bad white's playing. Check here, and The only thing white can do is forestall checkmate for one move and hope that black doesn't find queen takes pawn. I've got to tell you, at any level of chess, it's very unlikely that black will not find this move. White has probably lost the game by this point. So f3 is an absolute no-no. The only plus that I know about it is that since it's basically the worst move you can possibly play, you can use this to drive somebody insane with rage and then use their rage against them. So, and this is not going to work in a slow game, but I have seen somebody in a speed chess game play the following opening for white. It's the king taunt, or the king go round, and what you do is you make one full turn with your king. Before your king even gets to e1, I guarantee that 8 out of 10 opponents are going to be gnashing their teeth. And, you know, even strong players, if they do this against each other in a blitz game, the rage and the out-of-control anger of the black opponent can sometimes lead to a surprising white win. Now, realistically, I mean, white should already just lose the game because he's done nothing while black has developed a beautiful position. But if you were playing like speed chess, this would be a kind of psychological weapon. That's all I got for f3. I mean, basically it's pure horror. Okay, another move for white, f4. Now this move is not played often, mainly because of this downside, the weakness to the king. But you'll see that this move does put a pawn in the center, right, controlling some part of the center, and it does combo well with a knight development to f3 because the pawn will support further leaps of the knight. And most often your opponent will respond with either d5 or c5, right, staking out space for himself on the queen side, in which case white can play much like a Dutch defense. You know, put the knight here. One option that I like is to put the bishop here, which coordinates with that pawn. Another option is to play a system like this. And then what you want to do is you want to aim for e4, getting this duo of pawns, which gives you a lot of nice space in the center to the king side, center king side. So quite reasonable for white to get that. So there are a couple interesting ways to play this move f4, and it's a perfectly reasonable move to try. Another way to use this move is to then follow it up with d4, and what you're setting up is a stone wall, which is where you put all your pawns on dark squares, and then you plop your knight on e5, right, the point that your pawns are defending, and a weakness for black in the center, and then build up an attack behind that kind of space that you've made. The only downside is that this opening doesn't leave any role for this bishop. But actually, I mean, you should understand in chess that you won't always be able to put every piece of yours to good use, right? I mean, ideally you'd like to, and you shouldn't forget if you've got a bad piece. But sometimes you need to accept that you've got, you know, 4 good pieces and 1 bad piece, and that's how the cookie crumbles. Now, next up, moving this pawn. Now, this move here is actually a move which has been played by some grandmasters, including the US #1 Hikaru Nakamura, one of the top players in the world after winning the Tata Steel tournament in Wake-on-Zay this year. And obviously it's coming with bishop to g2. By now you guys can all see that coming, right, from our discussion of b3. This move here is putting a piece on a great square, and it's very flexible, and it's not a bad move at all. This is a totally respectable move, and that's one of the reasons why you will find a few games where top GMs have played it. It's going to combo well with c4 in a lot of cases, right, to help your bishop have an open diagonal, because your opponents often, I mean, one of the most obvious ways for them to play against this is to try and shut down that bishop, since he knows where that bishop is going. And then white's going to try to open his bishop up pretty soon, right, logically. So he's going to use this move at some point to try and soften d5, possibly immediately. I think the main reason g3 isn't played that much is that, again, it gives black a lot of flexibility. Um, so if black is pretty good at playing the opening, he can pick out, one of his favorite openings that should work pretty well against g3 and set up a formation against it. But this move here is perfectly good. It can transpose to an English opening with c4, knight c3, bishop g2. It can transpose to a Catalan opening with d4 and c4, gaining space and comboing with the bishop. It can also lead to a King's Indian style game, like I told you in my description of d3. Right? So if your opponent has played this way, you could now go for the King's Indian style, right, with the bishop here. And that is reasonable for white as well. So g3 is quite a reasonable move. And next we get to g4. Now this is the second move, which I'm going to basically have something pretty bad to say about, like f3. This move creates some really permanent weaknesses on your king side. So I'm going to emphasize the negative before I tell you the positive. The positive, you probably know, is that you can put your bishop on a really good square. And like with b4, it has the possible positive of gaining space on this side of the board. So in some ways, it can be interesting and helpful to have this pawn on this square, because if your opponent puts the knight here to control your bishop's diagonal, you've got g5 possibilities. You can look out for that kind of thing. But overall, I think having this hanging pawn on g4 and these weaknesses here is something which, if black plays really well, they can try and exploit. Now, a safe black player would just put the pawn here, try and block your bishop, and then take advantage of this. Another option for black is to get really risky, grab the pawn, and let white start working on crazy tactics on this diagonal. This pawn sacrifice by white is one of the main reasons that some people like playing g4. Because if black takes, the game becomes immediately tactical, risky, and unusual. So you can do really, really funny things to somebody in a position like this. And just to illustrate how tricky it can get, here's one possible variation which can happen, which leads to a hilarious little tactic. I'm sure you'll love getting your opponents with this one. Black's trying so hard to defend this d5 square and stay ahead their extra pawn for free, and they lose to a sudden double attack. That's typical. So there's a lot of sleazy, and I don't mean it in a bad way, a lot of sleazy players who like this g4 line, because bishop takes g4 can be quite fun. Now we've got a few more moves. Of h4, I basically have the same thing to say as about a4. The main benefit of the move is improving the position of your rook, but that's not going to be the case if you castle kingside. So white may have to use a strategy other than castling kingside, but that's annoying to already be committed to that so early, or possibly committed to it. And also, rooks aren't the easiest piece to use in the start of the game, so that's definitely not the most useful move you can play at the beginning. So of h4 and a4, I would say these are not such great openings. They're a little bit committal, and they're working towards developing a piece that's hard to develop. That said, one possible way to use this kind of opening is to do a fun little thing where you bum rush your opponent with the h-pawn, and against an inexperienced player, it's going to be really annoying for them to deal with the h-pawn. You can do the same thing on the a-file. So if you want to just mess around in some speed games, maybe try h5, h6, and have fun with that. You might need to move the d-pawn so your bishop helps with the pawn, right? And if you do it with your a-pawn, you might want to use your e-pawn to help out. But notice, I mean, if they play really well, what they're doing in the center is more important than our little pawn bum rush, but it's still interesting. And then there's h3, which is basically a waiting move like a3, but since it slightly weakens your king side, I prefer a3. However, if you really want to surprise somebody, you may well be able to give them a pretty funny surprise by playing h3 instead of a3, because this move is even less explored than a3, and they definitely won't really know how this affects their main openings. Almost nobody will. So it's another way for you to play black instead of white. Now there are two knight moves which I haven't discussed yet. One is knight to h3. Now this move, what's the positive? Bring out your knight. What's the negative? Not on the best square, a little bit committal, right? Well, the only interest in this move is really that it can lead to some interesting fights right away. If black plays this move here, e5, it's logical that white wants to get their knight off the side and starts this fight. And now black can play calmly with d6, or they can play d5. In either case, they've got a threat to take on h3, and this should again be my second and last warning to you all to watch out about opening up this diagonal early in the game. You don't want to be losing your games in 4 moves. So white has to play g3 to defend his knight, and black can now take, and take on f4. This wins a pawn for black, because does white want to take on f4? No, I don't need to warn you about it anymore, right? You know what's going to happen if white takes on f4. So this combination is possible for black, and like with 1g4, this would be one of the main reasons somebody would play this opening knight h3 as white, is because they know that black has this possible forcing variation to try and win a pawn, but they think that it's going to be really fun to play this very, very weird position after they castle quickly and get a lead in development. And this variation is extremely weird because black can immediately start an attack on white's king in addition to already being ahead a pawn. And this leads to very, 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 very strange play. As you can see, the rook coming out early, which I told you is pretty unusual. So knight h3 is kind of a quirky move, and if black doesn't want to get into those variations, the simplest thing to do is to let the knight come to f4, which is not going to devastate black anyway. g3 will be played to defend the knight and put the bishop here probably, and now black can play bishop f5, bishop g2, queen d7, knight f4, knight f6, and again you get one of these positions with the knight on f4 instead of f3, and you could play d4, or you could play c4. But you can get some interesting and quirky action going here, and I've personally even played knight h3 in tournaments. So knight h3 definitely not the best of the moves I've talked about today, and even that is good enough that you can play it in tournaments, as I've done so. Finally, the last move of the day is knight to c3. This move is a plausible enough move. It's been played once or twice by good GMs. I know that 𝐬𝐻𝐳 played it, I think. Well, obviously it brings the knight to a good square and attacks 2 central squares, right? And as I mentioned, knight f3 is actually a normal move for lots of grandmasters, so it shouldn't be a huge surprise that knight c3 is also a decent move. And there's a huge variety of openings that can be played out of knight c3. So there's no set structure yet for what white's going to do with these pawns. They have a whole lot of different choices. They could advance all of them or none of them pretty much still at this point, so I can't tell you too much about what's going to happen next. But since you've developed your knight towards the center, there's a lot of normal openings that can come up, and I'll just give you one example to give you a sense of what could happen. If black plays d5, white probably starts a fight with this pawn, and then if black defends his pawn, white plays d4, and look at that, we're basically back into French. Or black could defend it and white could play d4. We're back in a 𝐂𝐡𝐞. Some mainline openings, right? Or takes, and now let's say you play c6, d4, bishop f5 would be a 𝐂𝐡𝐞 again. There's a whole bunch of different options of what could happen. This variation, white hasn't yet played d4, and they're going to go after this bishop faster with h4, h5. So knight c3 has a lot possible. Again, just to give one more example, you can play d4 instead of e4, and then you transpose to an unusual d4 opening, which is d4 knight c3, with attempts to play e4, and even if your opponent stops you, you try and increase the pressure on these 2 squares. So knight c3 is a fully viable and not too explored move that you can have fun with. Alright, I hope you found that helpful, useful, and in the next videos, I'm going to start doing a rundown of all the most popular openings, but at the beginner level, just giving you a few pluses and minuses about each opening and what to expect about the style of play, so that you can basically use these videos as a way to pick out some openings that you're interested in, that you want to try out. And really, I strongly encourage you to try out some of these unusual first moves, which I have just mentioned to you today.